Today's scripture is Luke 15, 1 through 7. It's the parable of the lost sheep. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. Which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? When he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. And when he has come home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost." Just so, I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to Christ. Good morning. It's good to be with you this morning. Just looking around. Thank you for letting me serve. Thank you for being my friend. Thank you for being a friend to each other.
Thank you for being a friend.
I love you guys, and I want nothing more. I certainly want nothing more than for us to bond in the garment of Christ's redemptive love, and that's bonding agent is peace, it's forgiveness and love. And I'm excited as we grow in that cloth of Christ. He's making all things new. I wanted to quickly just share an update before we jump in. Bit of an awkward transition, but it's important. We're excited about some things that are happening in our church. We're in a season of, and have been for some time, of significant change. And change by definition is, psychologists and others will tell you, is crisis. We can't go around it or over it or under it. We walk through it, and we need one another to walk through it. And yet God continues to give us rays of light and hope, and I hear that, and I sense that from the Holy Spirit as well, and for that I'm very excited. I'm excited about how God has been gracious to bring a couple of individuals to partner and co-labor with you and with me. And yes, the Bible tells us to co-labor with God for His glory and for His purpose and mission of making all things new. And so you've gotten acquainted just a little bit with Seth Deckinga, his wife Rebecca, their two boys, Jude and Levi. We're so glad that they're here. This is a major move for them. Well, we appreciate them. Thank you. This is a major move for them, and I would ask that you would not let up on praying for a permanent place for them to reside. A house, whether it be because of the market, something that they could rent until something opens up, or something that God would graciously provide for them to purchase. They're living out of suitcases in a very gracious environment with Dan and Denise Libby, but with a family in a small quarters. Yes, thank you, Dan and Denise, for that hospitality and your grace. We want to transition them into a place they can call their own. So please, would you just continue to pray? If you know of a neighbor that hasn't put their house on the market yet, say, "Hold up, let me connect you with someone who's looking for a house." They need some adequate space for their family and yard to play in and place to store things and to enjoy fellowship with all of you in. I want to also bring you up to date on our incoming associate pastor, of children and family discipleship. Darlene Franks and her husband Barry, they have sold their home, and that is closing in mid-July. Talked with Darlene yesterday again, and she's all garage sailed out, and she is ready to pack up their things and have packed up their things, a lot of them, and will be moving over. She actually she twisted my arm a bit because I wanted her and thought it would be best for her to start mid-July. But being Darlene and her go-get-'em attitude, she said, "No, I want to start July 1st. Yeah, so I said, well, Dar, you know that we already have a vacation planned. I'm not going to be here." She said, "Stop thinking about yourself and let's get on with this." And so I, by no means, once she arrives, sending any message, not being here personally to welcome her, I am excited about the future, and her heart, her and Seth's heart and their family's hearts are so humble and pure and want nothing more for God's purpose in Oroville and in this community for this church to participate in that. It really goes along with what's happening in this short parable. Before we jump into it, though, I think we need to just grab a hold of a couple of things to understand a parable. A parable is not less than a story, it's more. It's a way of teaching, and Jesus roughly used this way, as recorded in the Gospels, 35 times, arguably 37. It was his preferred way of talking to the commoner, while not just talking through the commoner, but talking to the commoner. And the irony of that, in talking to those that were there to actually hear, he beautifully was able to talk about and talk to those that surrounded the edges that were there to critique and to condemn, those that were a part of the empire, those that were a part of the systems of the day, those that had the resource, those that had the power. And so he was talking to all people in the power of a parable. In Mark chapter 4, the gospel writer says, "With many such parables he spoke the word to them, as they were able to hear it." As they were able to hear it. "He did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples." Now, we have some of those explanations. And this might shock you, but the older I get and the more I read of the gospel narrative and God's story as a whole, because parables are not new to Jesus, it's a rabbinic type of teaching that had far outlast generation upon generation and generation, and still is used today for teaching in Judaism. Matter of fact, in many different areas of life, and we have them even today. But Jesus, it says, explained everything to them in private, but we only have some of the explanations. And as I said, as I grow older, I actually, and this might sound strange, I'm thankful that we only have some of those explanations. Because he didn't explain them to those that heard them. He explained them to his disciples. So begin to think about what he was actually doing. Well, I think what he was doing, one of probably the many things that the incarnate God was doing, was encouraging those that have ears to hear and eyes to see to not just listen, but to think. A couple of things that I just want to introduce to you, and I wrote them down because I'm going to go through them very quickly and maybe not even touch on a couple of them, but they're in your bulletins if you'd like to reflect on them. Simply, what is a parable? I mean, the very word parable, right, in its language that we get words like parallel or paradox. Parables compare two different things, unlike things, things placing them side by side, but with an ending or some sort of twist or turn that surprises, offends. It's unexpected in some ways. There's all different types of variety and lengths of parables. Parables have at least, not less than, but at least, many of them have so many more, and that's the power of the parable, but two meanings, a literal meaning and a metaphorical meaning. They're representing, in other words, something else, such as water can also give the picture of peace. Parables are not always allegorical. Let me explain what allegorical is, and I wrote it a little bit in here. It's the characters, the pieces of the story, the things that are happening within a parable are not always representative to one thing and one thing only. And often, with our minds, we want to go through and go, okay, here's the table. This thing is equal to this thing. And this person is equal to this person. Not so. And that's the power of a parable. Not less than that, but more. Parables don't have a single meaning. That might right there rub you the wrong way. And the parable now is working as you read the parables. Jesus didn't invent the parable, I said. It's a long-held tradition passed down through generations. Parables can be understood in many ways, and as eyes of a modern reader, we have to be careful to first ask and seek, what could the original hearers have heard? How would it challenged them? How would it have stirred up projections in them that they would then freely want to point their finger at whoever is in the story standing right next to them? We have to be careful to have ears that can hear beyond our experience. That's the power of a parable, and that's what I mean by going beyond just listening to a parable, but thinking. Parables provoke the hearer beyond listening to thinking. That's kind of this whole idea of this series, unboxing the parables of Jesus. Wrestling with the message and the meaning, and for it to be slippery, kind of like running your fingers through spaghetti, right? Something you can't necessarily grab a hold of. Parables usually don't reveal something new. This might be shocking to you, but hold on. Don't check out on me. Parables, I believe, and many scholars and those that wrestle with these texts and commit their life to wrestling with these texts and understanding this culture, it's not something that is new or profound, but that it's something that's true and that's actually already known by its hearers. But they've, for some reason, failed to see it, to act upon it, to believe it. So here's a couple of thoughts as we just briefly this morning, and we can't even do justice even to these couple of verses. Here's a couple of thoughts as we move towards engaging with this particular parable of Jesus, as we unbox it. If your first response in hearing this parable or hearing a parable in general is, I like that one. Again, who knows? I may get a few emails this next week, but if that's your reaction, you may just be listening and not thinking. You may not be at the point, and I want to encourage you to step beyond just listening to begin to engage and unbox that parable. And that takes vulnerability and courage. And you'll know what I mean more as we walk along this road. When you seek to keep a parable in your own box of understanding, it's because you're comfortable with it and you want to limit the power of the parable, and therefore you're limiting the power of the parable's impact on you and the community in which you live, the family in which you live, the relationships in which you live. It's a powerful, powerful way that Jesus teaches and continues to teach us, because God's Word is active and living, we know. A parable is unexpected and it's difficult to hear because it challenges often hidden values and biases that we have. We might not even be able to articulate them, but they bring to the surface, kind of like cream, those questions that we don't ask. We either refuse to ask the questions, or we don't even know the right question to ask. But they reveal the answer. These parables can reveal a direction, a light, a call. But it's interesting because that light and that call is actually, when we begin to see it, it grabs something so deep inside of us. It's like we've always known it. Go figure, God has made us in His image. It's that echo of Eden. It's almost like we knew it all along, but we didn't. That's the power of the parable. And unfortunately, we hear these parables, and our first reaction is dismissive. We domesticate. We force into a place or a space that we recognize and know. So maybe this morning, as we grapple a little bit with these few verses, we might take heed that our first reaction of a parable should probably be resistance instead of acceptance. So let's jump in. The parable actually starts in verse 3, and there's an obvious break in the text. We don't know exactly where Jesus was. We don't even know exactly who He was speaking to. And you may think, wasn't He speaking to tax collectors and sinners? Well, He was speaking to a crowd, and there was grumbling in the religious leaders of that day. We don't know exactly who He was speaking to. A good observation would be He's speaking to everyone. If you go back just to the last couple of verses in chapter 14 of the Gospel of Luke, you hear those famous words. Jesus says, "For those that have ears, may they hear. Those that have eyes, may they see." And indeed, I'm sure that He was inviting those, both critiques and those that were seeking. Tax collectors being the traitors of the day. They were Jews, but they had sold out to the empire and taking advantage in a treasonous way of their own people. Boy, that rubs you wrong. You wouldn't like those folks, and they didn't either. Sinners, not necessarily through the wording of, and in the original language, and I won't go into all of that, but the wording of sinners is not the same as outcasts. You can't read too much of Luke without repeating the word that Luke says, outcast, marginalized, whatever your text may say, that particular word. But here, Luke identifies sinners. Sinners necessarily are those that are living contrary, whether Gentile or Jew, whether those in or out, male or female, children, old, young, whatever it might be, but sinners that were using what they have for their own gain and keeping it from others, which was in contrast to what God had given to His people in the covenant of being a blessed people. Why? To bless the nations, to bless all, to be a blessing. And so it could be an umbrella term, but there were specific people that were there. Now we know that the religious leaders, scribes, and very educated along with the religious leaders, very knowledgeable, knowing by heart major parts, if not the entire law of Moses. And so Jesus speaks to them, but probably the most people that were there were the common folks. Those that had little means, little resource, and He says, so He told them this parable. Which one of you, having 100 sheep, after losing one of them? Natural reaction? Not me. Most of those that were here did not have resource to own sheep. Maybe they were a shepherd, maybe they were placed in the care or under the care or in the care of the owner of the sheep. We don't know all that was happening, but which one of you, having 100 sheep, lost one of them? They would say, not me, and right then, possibly they had checked out. You think about 100 sheep. Here, I have a picture for you that I want to bring up on the screen. On both sides of the screens, look really close. Is there a difference between both of those images? Are those a mirrored image or are they not? Well, if I gave you enough time, you could count them, right? And you know where I'm going with this. One side has 99, one side has 100. It's hard to notice. Those that have means, those that had enough money to have a fairly normal size of flock, 100, they would be okay with losing one, because if you go after one, you're putting 99 in harm's way. So then again, possibly now, even those that have checked out, that didn't have resource to even own one sheep, let alone 100, maybe they're re-engaged and they begin to get their pointer finger out or their elbow out to elbow Joe next to him or her and say, what about those guys in the long cloaks behind us with the beards and the prayer tassels and the religiosity attached to every fiber of their body? The Pharisees, the scribes, those that have resource. Or maybe looking over to someone that they have a lot of money because they're exploiting their own people and have made an agreement with those that are oppressing God's people, being a part of the very people of God. So here we have quite an issue, and we're just in the midst of the first part of this verse. You have some saying, not me, I couldn't, right? You have others that are saying, well, yes, I could, and of course, that's ridiculous. Maybe that particular person was just negligent, right? The shepherd, this shouldn't be called the parable of the lost sheep, but the oblivious shepherd, or the irresponsible shepherd, or the parable of the shepherd that lost the sheep. But just like that picture that I showed you up there, we couldn't tell the difference. You would have to really know your sheep to know that one is gone. And so one of the things that I think we need to engage in this and pay attention to is that the shepherd, whatever and whoever that shepherd may represent, and it's more probably than just one option, that shepherd notices first. Notices what is lost. This revelation to this shepherd causes him to have knowledge that he can either act upon in a passive way by dismissing it. I didn't need that sheep anyways. That one maybe was the one that wasn't going to get as much at the market. That one was sick. I can go on without. But no, that's not what this picture says. That's not what this parable paints. And so there has to be confusion both with the resourceful, the wealthy, the religious, and the commoner. Tax collector, sinner, this had to have grabbed them in a way that their ears perked up and thought, okay, here is someone with resource and wealth. Why would they take that risk? Jesus is saying this. He's claiming to be equal with God. We know Jesus to be the incarnation, God in flesh, not part God and part man, but 100% God and 100% man. And so those that were there were beginning to hear things, but they definitely would have heard that this shepherd noticed that something was missing. My question for us is, do we notice? And we'll get more into that in a moment. We move on to the second part of that verse. It then says, does not leave the 99, speaking of the caregiver. Leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it. Okay, so now you have this caregiver, this seeker, this shepherd, whether it is the owner or those that are the owner that had placed this shepherd in charge of this sheep, whatever it might be, not only notices, but now cares. Confession time. Every once in a while, when I lose my sensibility, we'll put it that way, I'm going to use my words hopefully right. My wife's going to laugh. I give the dog a little nudge with my foot. I don't know if Kim would say I kick the dog, but if the dog is licking me and jumping up on my leg or just wanting to play, just sitting there barking as she does from time to time and wanting to engage in, and I want nothing of it. I have something else on my mind. There's something that's pressing me down. What do? I don't even look at the dog. I lift my leg. I wrap the body of the dog around the inside of my foot, and I just relocate. If I'm honest, my mail's being read, and I'm not okay. Those with wealth and resource were justifying to themselves that this is a ridiculous story, possibly, and a reckless shepherd or owner to put 99 in harm's way and to go after one. Why didn't you just take your foot and sweep it under the rug and forget about it? It's just the cost of business. In the long haul, you'll make that back up. The ROI, it just doesn't make sense. But God, Jesus, claiming that He's God, could some ears begin to hear, is He talking about Himself, about God? Is He talking about Abraham? Is He talking about Moses or Elijah or Jacob or Isaac? Who is He talking about? But whoever this is has enough money to have a herd, has enough courage and care to notice and then do something about it. Those guys behind us with the tassels hanging from their belts and their beards draping long with wisdom, they would never go after the one. So could this be God? Yes, but let's not stop there. Moving on to 5. When he found it, the caregiver, the overseer, the shepherd, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. In the middle of nowhere, left the hillside, in the wilderness somewhere. Wilderness is interchangeable with the word desert in this original language, and so it's a place of risk, chaos, maybe in a metaphorical sense, especially throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. There's a risk involved here, and the shepherd stops when he sees this sheep, and he doesn't say, "Get over here." He doesn't grab him and spank him and turn around and start stomping back. But he stops, and what does he do? He lays it on his shoulders and he rejoices. I don't know too many shepherds, but I do know a son of an Australian shepherd family that came for some education at a seminary that I was at. And I remember having a conversation about not this particular text, but shepherds. And I remember saying, I don't know a shepherd. Tell me a little bit about sheep. And one of the things I remember him saying is he said, remember the lost sheep parable? I said, yeah. When the shepherd picks up the sheep and puts the sheep on his shoulder, there's no way that that sheep just lays nicely over the shoulder. Whenever you grab sheep's legs, and I know nothing about sheep, and if one of you are out there, maybe you could verify it. At least in Australia, sheep do this. But whenever you put legs together and restrict their activity, they're going to start fighting against you. But that didn't deter his rejoicing. That didn't deter his grip. It didn't deter what was going on and why he stopped and celebrated. He rejoiced. Nobody was watching. Nobody was there. That could even be heard reckless because they have to get back to the sheepfold because right now there may be a wolf if he didn't have a helpmate watching over the fold. So could it be that God values celebration? We moved into a house in Riverside, California when I was pastoring there. And one of the first nights, I don't remember if it was the first night or not, there was an incredible celebration in our neighbor's garage. And back patio and driveway and windows were open and you could hear what was happening. Later became our good friends, Eddie and Salome. They had their entire family over and there was a celebration as they explained it to me that was very significant in the legacy of their family and in turning points in their children's lives that had traveled from different places on this particular date to celebrate. And do you know how I felt once I heard the story of what that celebration was about? I felt about that big. Because all night I laid in my bed thinking bad thoughts about my neighbor. This could be a parable about a God that celebrates. What do you hear going on in this story? Well, we have to come to the very end, which there's incredible hope. Luke takes the parable and adds his interpretation, which turns this parable to an allegory, putting it one thing to another. We also have this same parable in Matthew 18, which says it a little bit different. And so there's a little bit of understanding here, and it's not less than, but I believe it's more. What would I say this parable is about? This parable is about God cares about lost things. God notices lost things. And God celebrates when lost things are found. God notices you. I'm so glad that it doesn't stop there. I notice my dog, and I relocate my dog. God notices you and cares about you. He cares about your neighbor that keeps you up at night. He cares about the person for the umpteenth time that has relapsed and their family has given up on them and their spouse is long gone. And maybe, I'm sorry, but the church has even given up on them. My heart is broke, and God's heart is broke. He cares about lost things. and he celebrates. He doesn't get the rules out. There's a series of these lost things parables, coins, sons, plural, irresponsible fathers. It's a powerful thing to be reminded that we are noticed, cared for, and celebrated over. We know sheep and coins, if we would have gotten into that lost story, which is the very next few verses. They don't repent. The woman that finds the coins or the shepherd that finds the sheep, they don't demand that. But don't hear what I'm not saying. The extravagant love of God causes a human heart to break open and to discover what they've always desired and dreamed of. It's like it's been with us from the beginning, but just marred, just broken, just blemished. What would it be like if you would hear this morning that God notices you, He cares for you, and He celebrates over you? Or maybe, what would it be like if you would hear this story and go, I haven't cared about lost things. I've written someone off in my book. God cares about lost things. Maybe it would be a point that you're at where you would think, God, help me to see the lost things. The people and the hearts. Give me eyes to see and ears to hear. God, give me the courage to get off of my high horse and to come into a common place, a common space, and share my life with someone that's not like me, around a table, possibly. Maybe I'm not willing to celebrate someone who has crossed me. God celebrates. And He leaves in a reckless way almost. You can't equate it one to one, but the picture's there. Individually and corporately. If we would take an ounce of our energy, my friends, an ounce of our piety, our religiosity, and would filter it into the mold that Jesus has given us by His life, His death, and His resurrection to love and to love well. And for that to be our best response, our first response, our Jesus response, and gather together and celebrate. Lives would be transformed, including yours, including mine, including ours. Would you stand with me as we close this morning? Simply a song, I'm sure you've heard it, Reckless Love. Again, almost a parabolic type song, right? God isn't reckless, but in our eyes. And in the eyes of the world, what? But that's what love does. That's what love is. That's how love is embodied.